In this lesson, we will look at a model of reading that was developed in the 1960s and 70s. This was the period of the popular whole language movement. The main pioneers of this theory of reading were Frank Smith, Kenneth Goodman, and Mary Clay. There has been a lot of controversy about this theory over the years, and it still continues to this day. Frank Smith was a Canadian psycholinguist and a proponent of the whole language approach to reading. He believed that reading and writing were naturally accomplished. Smith published several influential books, including his 1971 book, Understanding Reading, which became a fundamental text in the development of the whole language movement. Smith's theory was that children who were in a rich and meaningful linguistic environment would learn to read naturally. He claimed that we rely on prior knowledge, experiences, and contextual clues to read. He said, guessing is the most efficient manner in which to read and learn to read. He also said that teaching phonics can hinder the natural learning process. Here is a quote from Smith's 1978 book called Reading. The first alternative and preference is to skip over the puzzling word. The second alternative is to guess what the unknown word might be. And the final and least preferred alternative is to sound the word out. Phonics, in other words, comes last. Kenneth Goodman was another proponent of the whole language approach to reading. He was a university professor in Arizona. His theory was that reading and writing were developed in the same way as oral language, that is, naturally. Goodman published over 150 articles and book chapters, as well as several books. His 1967 article, Reading, a Psycholinguistic Guessing Game, is probably his most famous piece of work. Goodman's theory was that readers use three kinds of information or cues simultaneously: graphic, syntactic, and semantic information. He said, skill in reading involves not greater precision, but more accurate first guesses based on better sampling techniques. He believed that young children begin to sample and draw on syntactic and semantic information almost from the beginning, and that as they develop reading skill and speed, they rely on graphic cues less. We'll look a little more at these graphic, syntactic, and semantic cues later. In his 1967 article, A Psycholinguistic Guessing Game, Goodman included some examples of some reading that some children had done. This is a passage that a child read, and you can see the child's miscues or mistakes are noted on the passage. So we have hoped for opened, we have sounds instead of sounded, we have he instead of I, we have a complete different phrase in word meanings first, where the child said what it means. We have some difficulty with the word philosophical. We have his instead of the. We have some difficulty with the word fortune. So let's look at some of those mistakes from Goodman's point of view. Goodman believed that the mistakes such as substituting your or his for the disturbs neither the meaning nor the grammar of the passage. There is no reason to reject and correct it. So he believed that these mistakes of the high frequency words were no problem. He said these miscues appear to have little effect on the meaning of what the child is reading. The word hoped was substituted for open. Goodman said both of these words are verbs, and the words have key graphic similarities. And that's why the child made that mistake. Goodman said that the miscues suggest how the child was carrying out this psycholinguistic guessing game in reading. The child was anticipating the words rather than using precise sequential identification, that is, decoding the word from left to right. Here is a quote from that same article. Reading is a psycholinguistic guessing game. It involves an interaction between thought and language. Efficient reading does not result from precise perception and identification of all elements, but from skill in selecting the fewest, most productive cues necessary to produce guesses which are right the first time. The ability to anticipate that which has not been seen, of course, is vital in reading. Over in New Zealand, Mary Clay was a psychologist who was developing the same theory. Her theory was that good readers focus on meaning, using a variety of cues to read words, just the same as Smith and Goodman believed. Clay published over a dozen books and many articles. And she developed the Reading Recovery Intervention Program, which you're probably familiar with, or at least you've heard of it. In the 1960s, Mary Clay completed her doctoral thesis called Emergent Reading Behavior. For this, she observed the reading behavior of 100 children once a week during their first year of school. Each child read small books based on the lessons they were receiving in class. Clay was particularly interested in the children's errors and self-corrections. She analysed the records to find out what type of errors the children were making and what they did to self-correct. She noted that 72% of the errors made by beginning readers were syntactically appropriate. So this meant that the children were using syntax or structure cues to read words. She noted that 55% of the children's errors were contextually appropriate, which meant that the children were using context cues. She theorized that children predicted what words would occur and could learn to visually check if the words they predicted were correct. She claimed that this would happen slowly over the course of the first year at school, eventually developing into this predict and check procedure. Clay's study led to the development of an observation tool that would become the running record, which is still in wide use today. A running record is used to observe the reading behavior of children as they read a book. In a running record, you observe difficulties, you evaluate the text difficulty for the child, whether it's easy, instructional, or hard. You use it to group children for instruction and monitor their progress. M, S, and V are the cues used in errors and self-corrections, and these are noted on the running record. M stands for meaning. These are the errors that make sense. Structure. These are the errors that are grammatically correct. And visual. These are the errors that are based on how the words look. You can see here on the left, you would record the children's correct words and their mistakes. And then on the right, you would mark whether the errors or the self-corrections were meaning, structure, or visually based. Here's an example of a completed running record taken from one of Mary Clay's books. The text is on the right-hand side, and this book was called The Bicycle. There would have been one phrase on each page with a picture. The clown got on, and the lady got on, and the boy got on, and the girl got on, and the bear got on, and the bicycle got squashed. So on the left, you can see the ticks for all the words that the child read correctly. And you can see the errors that the child made. And on the right, then, we have some information about the errors, whether they were meaning, structure, or visual. So you can see here that John said girl instead of lady, So you can see on the right that he was using meaning and structure here. He said man instead of boy. So again, he's using meaning and structure. And for bicycle, he read bike. So he was using meaning and structure here, but also he was using visual cues. He looked at the beginning of the word to guess or predict what the word was going to be. And then for the last word, squashed, he read flat. So he's using meaning and structure here, probably the picture, and it would have been the same for girl and man. So Clay said, John used language information and all of his errors reflected the use of meaning and sentence structure. He did not seem to be aware of the mismatch between what he said and the visual information in the text. After reading, the teacher asked John, what was the new word you read? And he said, bicycle. Teacher asked, how did you know it was a bicycle? And he said, it was a bike. I think he's referring to the picture here. Then the teacher said, what did you expect to see? He said, a bee. Teacher asked, what else? John said, a little word, but it wasn't. So you could see that what was written was a longer word. Teacher asked, so what did you do? John said, I thought of bicycle. And the teacher said, good. I like the way you worked at that. Rather than telling the children the mistakes that they've made or giving them the correct word, Clay recommended the use of prompts or questions to help the child. These prompts include, does that make sense? Would that fit here? Does it look right? Look at the picture. Or what do you expect to see at the beginning? Clay said that if the child has a bias towards letter detail, the teacher's prompts will be directed towards the message and the language structure. Some people say that using meaning, structure, and visual cues, or 3-cueing, or psycholinguistic guessing game, are not guessing. However, guessing is a term that Frank Smith, Kenneth Goodman, and Mary Clay all used when talking about children reading. Clay said that we need to give opportunities to the child to hear the new words which he will have to guess from the pictures and language context. She also said to let the child predict the word he expects it to be. Cover the problem word and ask for something you know he knows about the word. What do you expect to see at the beginning? At the end? Clay talked a lot about first letter cues, looking at the beginning of the word and using meaning and structure cues to help you predict what the word might be. She told teachers to do things such as prompt to the word beginning. Ask him, what letter would he expect to see at the beginning? To sound the initial letter, if necessary. To ask, what does elephants start with? And to ask, do you know a word that starts with those letters? According to Clay, all readers need to use meaning and sentence structure cues, first and last letter cues, before resorting to left to right sounding out. Single letters are used as a last resort. Mary Clay talked a lot about cross-checking. She believed that children use meaning and structure cues to predict what words and text would be, but that then children might look at the letters of the word to check whether what they predicted was correct or not. She said, is the child checking one or more kinds of information against another? She said that a child may make another attempt when they make a mistake, or look back, or think again. She said that children may anticipate the language structure or use meaning and then notice that the letters they expected aren't there. If they don't do that, she suggested using the prompt, does that look right? We will return to this idea of cross-checking later in the lesson. We'll finish this section with a quote from Mary Clay. Language has two powerful bases for prediction in reading. The first is the meanings, and the second is the sentence structures. A third, less reliable and sometimes confusing and distorting source of cues exists in the letter-sound relationships. The psycholinguistic guessing game, or MSV, are probably more commonly known as 3-cueing. And this theory is still very popular today. And I want to introduce you to two people who are pioneers of 3-cueing. That is Irene Fountas and Gay-Sue Pennell, otherwise known as Fountas and Pennell, or F&P. So Fountas and Pennell are most well known for guided reading. They are supporters of Mary Clay's work and have written about the influences that she has had on their work, especially on guided reading. Fountas and Pennell developed a levelling system for use in guided reading. So this was a system for assigning levels to books that children would read. Children are then assessed using running records, and their instructional level is assigned. So that's the text that they can read with 90 to 94% accuracy. Students are then grouped for guided reading based on their level. And teachers are encouraged to use prompts that Mary Clay developed, such as, does it look right? Does it make sense? The benchmark assessment system by Fountas and Pennell, or the BAS, was studied by Parker and colleagues in 2015. It was shown to be 54% effective in identifying students who were at risk of reading difficulties. So it's about as accurate as a flip of a coin. In recent years, Fountas and Pennell have come under quite a lot of fire. In 2001, they released a series of blog posts. Now, these blog posts have since been removed from their website, but I wanted to show you a quote from one of those blog posts. The goal for the reader is accuracy, using all sources of information simultaneously. If a reader says pony for horse because of information from the pictures, that tells the teacher that the reader is using meaning information from the pictures, as well as the structure of the language, but is neglecting to use the visual information of the print. His response is partially correct, but the teacher needs to guide him and stop and work for accuracy. Soon after those blog posts were released, Mark Seidenberg issued a response. Mark Seidenberg is a research professor and senior scientist. He's a specialist in psycholinguistics, focusing on the cognitive and neurological basis of language and reading. He said, if a child is reading pony as horse, these children haven't been taught to read, and they're already being given strategies for dealing with their failures. This is backwards. If the child were actually given better instruction in how to read the words, then it would obviate the need for using all these different kinds of strategies. Here's another quote from Seidenberg's blog post. Pause the video and read it yourself. For this next section, we're going to talk about the predictability of text. Keith Stanovich stated, in no instance has context been found to help good readers more than poor. If anything, poor readers make better use of context than good readers. So how predictable is text really? How well can we use meaning and structure cues to predict the words that come up in text? Let's look at a couple of examples. This is a page from a leveled reader. This is from the PM readers, and this is a level 12. I've covered some of the words. I want to see, can you figure out what these covered words are using meaning and structure? You can also use the picture. So at the big, we have two words missing. Jake got into the something. He loved something. Max did not want to get in at. He sat with his something in the something and looked at Jake. Let's look at each of these words. At the big swimming pool, Jake got into the water. He loved swimming. Max did not want to get in at first. He sat with his, might need to look at the picture for this one, feet in the water and looked at Jake. So this text is very predictable. The sentences are written in such a way to support the use of meaning and structure cues for reading. A child who's reading a level 12 may or may not be able to read the words swimming, pool, water, first, feet, using decoding ability alone. A lot of kids will rely on meaning and structure to figure out these words. And this is also the case as we go up through the higher levels. Here's an example from a PM level 16. Katie had gone down the track. She had gone off by something to find the something cave. The track was wet and something. After Katie had walked a little way, she found the cave by the side of the track. Katie looked something. It was dark, but then she saw. So, can you predict these words using meaning and structure? Katie had gone down the track. She had gone off by herself to find the secret cave. The track was wet and, use the picture here, muddy. After Katie had walked a little way, she found the cave by the side of the track. Katie looked inside. It was dark, but then she saw something. So you can predict a lot of these words using meaning and structure, maybe the first letter, but then when presented with these words in isolation, out of context, out of this book, children may struggle to read them. So while leveled readers may be written in a way to support the use of meaning and structure cues, is this the case in other texts, in authentic children's literature, in newspaper articles, in instruction manuals? Well, Goff said, it is often incorrectly assumed that predicting upcoming words and sentences is a relatively easy and highly accurate activity. But naturalistic text is not that predictable. He used Reader's Digest articles to investigate the predictability of text. Here's what he found. Skilled adult readers could correctly predict 40% of function words. So these are your high frequency words like the, of, and 10% of content words. Those are your nouns and your verbs and your adjectives and those kind of words. So skilled adult readers could only correctly predict 40% of function words and 10% of content words. In another study, Finn found that 29.5% of words could be correctly predicted. This sentence is from a passage that was given to hundreds of students, with every fifth word deleted. There were 5 alternate forms of the passage so that each word in the passage was deleted on one of the forms, so they were able to measure the predictability of every word. The sentence reads, more than 1 million other people live in the suburbs of something. Can you predict what that last word is? Maybe if I gave you the first letter, it's a W. Well, the people in the study didn't have the first letter. They only had the meaning and the structure to go by. And it was Washington. And 30% of the people who took part in this study were able to guess the word Washington correctly, when it was deleted. How were they able to do that? Well, the word had already appeared 6 times in that passage before this sentence. When the word suburbs was deleted, nobody guessed it correctly because it was the first time that it appeared in the passage. Smith, Goodman and Clay came up with their theories in the 1960s and 70s. Since then, we have the benefit of different types of scientific research that did not exist at that time. This includes various types of brain imaging and eye tracking. What we know from these fields of research is that skilled readers process every letter in the word using the left hemisphere of the brain. Poor readers, on the other hand, who rely on meaning and structure to identify words, use the right hemisphere of the brain more. We want children to become skilled readers, processing every letter in the word from left to right, rather than relying on meaning and structure in the first instance to identify words, because this is what struggling readers do, and we don't want to teach them to do that. Proponents of MSV or 3Qing or psycholinguistic guessing say that children use first meaning and structure cues to predict what a word might be, and then the visual or the letters to confirm or deny if the word that they predicted was correct or not. In a recent book called The 6 Shifts by Perkins and Yates, the authors recommended switching this up a little bit, starting with V, the visual, and then moving on to M and S, or meaning and structure. They recommend first look at the word and sound it out from left to right. This is what skilled readers do. We decode the word. Then use meaning and structure to confirm if the word you read is correct, but if it's not, then you can use the meaning and structure to determine the actual word, to correct your mispronunciation. Then, if needed, reread the sentence or read on to cross-check the meaning. This is also called set for variability. Let's look at an example of mispronunciation correction or set for variability using visual first and then meaning and structure. So the child uses the letters and decodes the word from left to right, but they say ginormous. So they've used the visual and they've sounded it out. But then they realize, well, that's not a word that I know. I've never heard the word ginormous before. So what they do then is they use meaning and structure to correct this. So they can go back over the sentence and see if that will help, or they can flex some of the sounds in the word. So here we need to flex that I sound, that short I, to a long I, and the word then becomes ginormous. And now the child might realize, oh, I know that word. That means big, and that makes sense in this sentence. And they continue on. So the first port of call is the visual, decoding from left to right. If it doesn't make sense, if it doesn't fit in with the structure, we can use that mispronunciation correction to flex, usually the vowel sounds, to see if we can figure out what the word actually is. I'll finish off this very long lesson with just a very simple quote from Mark Seidenberg, which I think encapsulates the whole thing. The best cue to a word is the word itself.